Wamma. What happens when a nation dares to wage war against God's chosen people? What becomes of a bloodline that vows eternal hatred against Israel, refusing to relent even when centuries roll like waves upon the shore? Picture it. The desert sun, blazing like molten bronze, the weary Israelites stumbling out of Egypt's chains, tasting freedom for the first time in their lives, their sandals still caked with the dust of Pharaoh's pursuit, their hearts pounding with the memory of the Red Sea's crashing walls. They march onward, men, women, children, toward a promised land whispered to Abraham generations before. Yet, before they can draw a breath of peace, a shadow appears on the horizon. Amalek, a tribe driven not by survival, but by spite, striking the weakest at the rear, the old, the frail, the children like jackals, preying on lambs. The battlefield was not just sand and blood. It was a cosmic theater. On one side, Israel, fragile, newborn, yet carried by the covenant of Yahweh. On the other, Amalek, the embodiment of enmity itself, sworn to extinguish the seed of promise before it could bloom. While Joshua raised his sword, Moses stood upon the hilltop, his weary arms lifted toward heaven. When his hands fell, Amalek prevailed. When they rose, Israel conquered. It was no ordinary skirmish. It was prophecy incarnate, a revelation that Amalek would be set against Israel from generation to generation. But the story does not end in the desert. Like a curse carved into the bedrock of time, Amalek resurfaces again and again. In the days of Saul, when the prophet Samuel thundered God's command to annihilate them utterly, the king's hesitation left seeds of rebellion still alive. From those remnants rose Haman the Agagite in Persia, scheming to wipe out the Jewish people in a single day. Amalek's shadow stretched into the Holocaust, where Hitler cloaked himself in modern power, yet carried the same ancient hatred. And today, on Israel's borders, in the cries of those who call for her destruction, does the ghost of Amalek not still whisper? Consider the weight of such a legacy. Unlike Babylon or Persia, who faded into dust after their moment of glory, Amalek is not remembered for empire or achievement, but for an unrelenting enmity. They are remembered because the Bible names them not as a people of land and city, but as a spirit of opposition. Amalek is the eternal antagonist, the curse that never sleeps. This is not just a tale of wandering tribes and forgotten wars. This is the tale of an ancient hatred that has outlived nations, crossed millennia, and now stirs again in our modern headlines. It is a prophecy that warns us. The same force that struck Israel in the wilderness has not vanished. It waits, it schemes, it strikes at the weakest first. This is not merely history. This is the unfinished prophecy of Amalek, and it still haunts Israel's borders today. Long before the clash in the wilderness, long before Amalek's raiders descended upon Israel's weary caravan, the seeds of this enmity were sown deep in the soil of bloodlines and covenants. To understand Amalek's curse, one must journey back to the patriarchs, to the tangled family tree of promise and rejection, blessing and curse. In the beginning stood Abraham, called out of Ur to become the father of many nations. Through him, the covenant was forged, a promise of land, seed, and blessing. Yet even as God set apart a chosen line, other branches grew wild. Ishmael, son of Hagar, would become a great nation, but the covenant passed instead to Isaac. From Isaac's household came two sons who wrestled in the womb, Jacob and Esau. Their struggle was more than sibling rivalry. It was a cosmic signpost. Two nations are in your womb. the Lord told Rebekah, "and the older shall serve the younger." Esau, red and wild, became the father of Edom. His descendants would bear a simmering resentment against the children of Jacob, who later was named Israel. Amalek entered the story as a grandson of Esau, his lineage marked by ferocity and a thirst for blood. Thus, Amalek was not a distant foreigner, but kin, a relative turned eternal foe. And perhaps that is what made his hatred burn hotter. Nothing cuts so deep as betrayal from within the family. The Bible paints Amalek not as a tribe struggling for survival, but as a people who made enmity itself their inheritance. Where Israel walked by covenant, Amalek walked by defiance. Where Jacob clung to the angel and received a blessing, Amalek sharpened the sword to strike at the stragglers. From the very beginning, their destiny was written in stark contrast. Israel chosen to bless the nations, Amalek determined to curse them. The Sacred Chronicle shows us again and again how God's promises ripple through history. Every bloodline, every covenant, every oath sets the stage for what follows. When Abraham ascended Mount Moriah with Isaac, the covenant was sealed in obedience. When Jacob dreamed of a ladder reaching into heaven, he saw the gateway of God's presence. These were moments when heaven and earth intertwined, when the divine hand guided history toward redemption. Yet woven into that same tapestry were darker threads, men and nations who rose up to resist, to oppose, to derail the plan of God. Amalek was chief among them. Consider how Israel's first encounters after Egypt were not random. Pharaoh's armies had already been shattered in the sea, their chariots sunk like stones. Israel's path was marked by miracle after miracle. Water from the rock, manna from heaven, a pillar of fire by night. Yet the first enemy they faced in open battle was not a mighty empire, but their own bloodkin, Amalek. Why? Because this was not merely a geographical obstacle. It was spiritual inevitability. The covenant people could not step into destiny without confronting the one who bore the mantle of eternal hatred. Amalek became a symbol in Israel's memory. In Deuteronomy, God commands, "Remember what Amalek did to you on the road as you came out of Egypt. You shall blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven. You shall not forget." The language is chilling. Not just fight them, not just defend yourselves, but a divine decree of erasure. Amalek had crossed a line, not only assaulting Israel's body, but striking at God's covenant itself. The war was not between tribes, but between heaven's decree and human rebellion. Across the centuries, this curse echoed. The Amalekites would raid, burn, and enslave, appearing suddenly like wolves out of the wilderness. In the days of Gideon, they swarmed like locusts, devouring Israel's harvest. In the days of Saul, they stood as the test of obedience. Would Israel's king fully carry out God's judgment, or would he falter? Amalek became a touchstone, a name synonymous with hatred, cruelty, and rebellion against God. Thus, the origins of Amalek are not just dusty genealogies in a forgotten scroll. They are the roots of a curse that still bears bitter fruit. From Abraham's tents to Esau's bitterness, from Jacob's covenant to Amalek's sword, the stage was set. The world had been given a promise of blessing through Israel, but Amalek chose to stand forever as its enemy. And so, before kingdoms rose, before prophets thundered, before empires clashed, the line had already been drawn in the sand. Israel would carry the covenant. Amalek would carry the curse. The wilderness stretched wide and merciless, a barren sea of rock and heat. Israel had just emerged from slavery, their chains barely broken, their backs still scarred by Egyptian whips. They were not warriors. They were shepherds and brickmakers, carrying children on their shoulders and dragging wagons filled with tents. They were a people newborn, not yet a nation of soldiers. Yet it was in this fragile moment that the first prophetic clash erupted. Amalek came. The Bible spares no words of flattery for their tactics. They did not challenge Israel face to face in open battle. Instead, Amalek crept like a viper, striking the weakest from behind, the tired, the elderly, the stragglers too slow to keep up. Their hatred was not simply military, it was predatory. Theirs was a war of annihilation, not conquest. They sought to smother Israel's hope in its infancy, to extinguish the covenant people before they could put down roots. Yet what unfolded at Rephidim was no ordinary battle. It was a revelation, a prophetic drama etched in blood and stone. Joshua, the young warrior, was chosen to lead the men of Israel into combat. The clash rang out in the desert, swords striking, cries rising, the air thick with dust and blood. But the true battlefield was not on the ground. It was on the hill where Moses stood, staff in hand, arms outstretched toward heaven. He embodied Israel's link to divine power. As long as his hands were raised, Israel gained ground. When his arms sagged from exhaustion, Amalek pressed forward. The scene was almost unbearable in its simplicity. Victory did not depend on numbers, weapons, or skill. It depended on intercession, on a frail man's arms lifted toward heaven in dependence on God. When Aaron and Hur propped up Moses' arms, Israel surged forward and prevailed. And in that moment, the truth became clear. This was not a tribal skirmish, but the first war of covenant. Israel could not win by flesh alone. They could only triumph under the covering of Yahweh. The aftermath seared itself into Israel's memory. God declared through Moses, "Because the Lord has sworn, the Lord will have war with Amalek from generation to generation." These were not idle words. This was a decree, a prophetic sentence echoing into eternity. Amalek had made itself the sworn enemy, not just of Israel, but of God himself. Why did this clash matter so much? Because it set the pattern. Every future conflict between Israel and her enemies would echo this same truth. Israel's survival was not secured by strength of arms, but by the covenant. Amalek was more than a tribe. They were the embodiment of hostility toward God's promises. To fight Amalek was to confront the very spirit of rebellion against the divine plan. This was the first prophetic clash, a microcosm of the cosmic war. On one side, frail men upheld by prayer, bound by covenant. On the other, ruthless hatred, relentless in its desire to erase God's people. The battlefield of Rephidim was not the end of Amalek, but the beginning of an eternal enmity. And so, the story marched forward. From this day onward, Amalek was not just an enemy of Israel. They were a shadow on the horizon of prophecy, a reminder that as long as Israel walked toward its destiny, Amalek would lurk, waiting to strike. The dust of the wilderness was only the beginning. Israel's enemies would not remain as scattered raiders striking in the night. Soon the horizon darkened with the rise of empires, colossal powers whose armies thundered like storms across the ancient world. Babylon, Assyria, Egypt, Persia, each rose in splendor, each flexed its might, each threatened to devour the covenant people. The Bible does not describe these empires merely as political powers. They are beasts in Daniel's visions, monstrous forms, rising from the chaotic sea of nations. A lion with eagle's wings, a bear devouring flesh, a leopard with 4 wings, and finally a terrifying beast beyond description. These images were not poetic flourishes. They were revelations. Empires were more than governments. They were instruments, either of judgment or of deliverance, permitted to rise and fall under the sovereign hand of God. Assyria came first with ruthless ferocity. Its kings carved their victories into stone, boasting of flayed captives and cities burned to ash. Their chariots rolled into the northern kingdom of Israel, scattering the 10 tribes like chaff in the wind. To the prophets, Assyria was not just a conquering army. It was the rod of God's anger, a tool to discipline a rebellious people. Yet Assyria's arrogance would not go unchecked. When they set their eyes on Jerusalem, Isaiah declared that God himself would break the yoke. And so it was. 185,000 Assyrian soldiers fell in a single night, struck down by the angel of the Lord. Then came Babylon, the glittering jewel of Mesopotamia. Its walls towered, its ziggurats reached toward the heavens. Nebuchadnezzar, the king who dreamed of a golden statue, marched upon Judah and tore down the very temple of God. The exiles wept by the rivers of Babylon, asking, "How shall we sing the Lord's song in a strange land?" Yet even here, prophecy unfolded. Daniel stood in Babylon's courts, interpreting dreams, declaring that kingdoms rise and fall, but the God of heaven will establish one kingdom that shall never be destroyed. Babylon, in all its glory, was but a shadow passing through time. Persia followed, swift and disciplined. Cyrus the Great conquered Babylon without a battle, his empire stretching from India to the Mediterranean. Yet, unlike the cruelty of Assyria or the arrogance of Babylon, Persia became an instrument of restoration. Cyrus issued a decree. The Jews could return home and rebuild the temple. Prophets had named him long before his birth, calling him God's anointed, though he knew not the Lord. Even the might of Persia was bent to serve the covenant plan. Egypt too played its part, not merely in Israel's past as the house of bondage, but in later centuries as a land of refuge and intrigue. Kings rose, armies marched, and prophecies pointed again and again to the great river Nile as a stage where God's purposes were revealed. One empire after another rose like waves against the shore, each claiming permanence, each declaring itself eternal. Yet all crumbled into dust. Only Israel, though scattered, endured, and always in the shadows, Amalek lingered, sometimes as raiders, sometimes as agitators, sometimes as the spirit of hatred, finding new vessels in every age. The prophets looked upon these empires and asked, were they not all tools in the hand of the Almighty? Did not God raise up and tear down at his command? Daniel's visions warned of beasts, but also promised a stone, cut without hands, that would shatter every kingdom. Ezekiel thundered against Tyre, Babylon, and Egypt, yet always with the refrain, God rules history. Here lies the haunting question that echoes still. Were these empires, mighty, cruel, magnificent, merely tools in God's hand? The prophets were not historians. They were heralds, voices crying in the wilderness of human pride, declaring that empires may roar and armies may march, but it is the word of the Lord that endures forever. Their warnings cut through the noise of kings and generals, painting history not as random chaos, but as a stage where God's decrees unfold. When Moses recorded the attack of Amalek, the warning was etched into Israel's soul. The Lord will have war with Amalek from generation to generation. Exodus 17:16. This was no passing feud. It was a decree that Amalek would always rise again, and Israel must always be ready. In Deuteronomy, the command sharpened. You shall blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven. You shall not forget. Deuteronomy 25-19. Forgetting, the prophets implied, was more dangerous than the sword. To forget Amalek was to leave the back door open to destruction. Samuel's warning to King Saul thundered like a verdict from heaven. Utterly destroy Amalek, leave nothing alive. Yet Saul faltered, sparing King Agag and the best of the spoils. His partial obedience became disobedience, and his throne began to crumble. This failure was not just about livestock or royal prisoners. It was about defiance against the divine decree. Amalek, spared for a moment, would rise again. Generations later, in the Persian Empire, Haman the Agagite plotted genocide against the Jews. The prophecy lived on because Saul had faltered. The prophets also warned of empires as beyond Amalek, yet the theme remained the same. Isaiah looked upon Babylon's glittering palaces and declared, Fallen, fallen is Babylon, and all the images of her gods lie shattered on the ground. Isaiah 21-9. Jeremiah foresaw armies from the north, sweeping like a boiling cauldron, yet insisted, But I am with you, declares the Lord, to deliver you. Jeremiah 1:19. Ezekiel thundered against Gog and Magog, names that would echo through millennia as symbols of the final enemy rising in the last days. The warnings of prophecy are not whispers, but trumpet blasts. They tell us that hatred against Israel is never merely political. It is spiritual. Amalek was not simply a tribe, Babylon not merely a kingdom, Gog not just a far-off nation. They were vessels of an ancient hostility, manifestations of a rebellion that runs deeper than geopolitics. And so the prophets warned Israel, and through them, the world, not to be deceived by appearances. Amalek may come as raiders in the wilderness, or as a court official in Persia, or as a tyrant in Europe, or as voices today crying for Israel's erasure. The form may change, but the curse remains. Could these words be unfolding in our own time? The Bible insists that Amalek is not merely a name buried in the sands of antiquity. Amalek is a spirit, an eternal enmity against God's covenant people. And if we dare to open our eyes, we see its shadow stretching across the headlines of our own age. Israel, reborn in 1948 after nearly 2,000 years of exile, stands once again in the land sworn to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Yet, from the very day of her birth, enemies rose up on every side. Armies marched, missiles flew, and the cry, "Drive them into the sea," echoed from pulpits and parliaments across the Middle East. Like Amalek of old, these enemies often strike the vulnerable. Buses full of school children, families celebrating holy days, elderly men and women walking to synagogue. History repeats itself with chilling precision. When Hamas tunnels into Israel's towns, when rockets rain down upon civilian neighborhoods, we glimpse the same cruel logic that drove Amalek to strike the weary and defenseless at Rephidim. When Iran proclaims its desire to wipe Israel off the map, are we not hearing the ancient curse reborn in modern tongues? Amalek has no single flag, no single army, no single nation. It manifests wherever hatred of Israel hardens into violence and the dream of her destruction. Consider the rise of Iran as a regional power. Its leaders boast of missiles capable of striking the heart of Jerusalem. They funnel weapons to Hezbollah in Lebanon and to militias in Syria and Iraq, encircling Israel with threats. To some, this is mere politics, but through the lens of prophecy, we see the old pattern. Amalek's spirit taking on new flesh, clothed in the uniforms of militias, hidden in the rhetoric of clerics. Russia, too, hovers on the edge of prophecy, once seen as the bear of the Cold War. Today it entwines itself in the Middle East, arming Israel's enemies and seeking influence in Damascus and Tehran. Ezekiel's vision of Gog and Magog, an alliance from the north set against the land of Israel, suddenly feels less like distant myth and more like tomorrow's news. Could it be that these alignments are the very foreshadowings the prophets warned us to watch for? And then there is the persistent question of Palestine. The conflict between Israelis and Palestinians is often framed as political, territorial, or humanitarian. Yet, beneath the surface lies the deeper reality of prophecy. The land itself, Judea, Samaria, Jerusalem, is not merely soil and stone. It is covenant territory, sworn by oath to Abraham's descendants. Every clash over borders, every battle over settlements, every outcry over Jerusalem's status. These are not just disputes of modern politics. They are echoes of an ancient war over who will inherit the promise. The United Nations debates resolutions. Diplomats shuttle between capitals. Peace accords are signed and broken. Yet the cycle continues, as though some unseen hand ensures the tension never dissolves. Is this not the very war from generation to generation spoken over Amalek? Even the rise of global anti-Semitism reminds us that Amalek's curse has never faded. From swastikas scrawled on synagogues in Europe to Jewish students harassed on American campuses, the hostility festers. It is irrational, often detached from politics altogether. Jews are blamed for opposite evils simultaneously, for being too powerful and too weak, too rich and too poor, too nationalist and too cosmopolitan. Such contradictions reveal the truth. This is not logic. This is hatred driven by a spirit older than Rome, older than Babylon. Hatred born in the bloodline of Amalek. And yet Israel endures. Surrounded by enemies, besieged in wars, targeted by terror, she lives. The desert has bloomed, technology has flourished. A language once considered dead has become the tongue of millions. Against all odds, Israel thrives because she carries not just history, but prophecy. The nations rage, but the covenant remains. Look closely, and you will see the old story repeating. Amalek struck the weak at Rephidim. Terrorists strike the defenseless in Israel's streets. Haman plotted annihilation in Persia. Iran declares its intent to erase Israel from the map. The prophets warned of alliances from the north. Russia and Iran entwine their fates in Syria. Generation to generation, the curse endures. But the endurance of Amalek only magnifies the endurance of Israel. For though the spirit of enmity rises in every age, the covenant has not been broken. Indeed, the very survival of Israel in our headlines testifies that prophecy is not dead ink on a page. It is a living drama. We are not reading history. We are living inside prophecy right now. What if the wars we see are only shadows of a greater war, raging beyond human sight? What if the missiles, the speeches, the armies are but puppets moved by hands unseen? Scripture pierces the veil for us. For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places. Ephesians 6:12. Amalek was never just a tribe. Babylon was never just an empire. The hatred that fueled them was not born from politics alone. It was and is an outflow of the cosmic rebellion that began when Lucifer defied the throne of God. The serpent that whispered in Eden still whispers today, seeking to devour the covenant people, because in them lies the story of redemption. Strike Israel, and you strike the stage where God has chosen to unveil his plan. This is why the spirit of Amalek resurfaces in every age. The demonic hosts know that Israel is more than a nation. It is the prophetic clock of history. Every assault is an attempt to derail the covenant, to make God a liar by erasing the people through whom the Messiah came, and through whom the Messiah will return. The hatred is irrational because it is spiritual. It cannot be explained by economics, borders, or politics alone. It is the echo of a rebellion older than humanity, and so the battlefield stretches far beyond Gaza or Tehran, beyond Washington or Moscow. It stretches into the invisible realms where angels contend and demons plot. When Israel fights for survival, when the Jewish people endure hatred in exile or in their homeland, they are not just facing men. They are standing against principalities and powers bent on erasing God's covenant from the earth. Yet the Bible assures us, though the spiritual battle is fierce, the outcome is already written. The Lamb has triumphed. The serpent's doom is sealed. The question is not whether Israel will endure. It is how many storms she must weather before the final deliverance comes. History strains toward a climax. The prophets did not speak in riddles to amuse, nor did they craft poetry for the sake of art. They declared the end from the beginning, unveiling a finale where the spirit of Amalek and all the enemies of God converge for one last, terrible battle. The book of Revelation paints the canvas. Nations gathering like storm clouds, demonic spirits leaping from the mouths of rulers, drawing kings toward the valley called Armageddon. Joel foresaw the same, a time when multitudes stand in the valley of decision, and the sun and moon grow dark as the Lord roars from Zion. Ezekiel envisioned Gog of the land of Magog sweeping down with a vast alliance, horses and chariots thundering to cover the land of Israel like a storm. And Zechariah declared that all nations will gather against Jerusalem, and the city will be taken, the houses plundered, the women ravished. The picture is harrowing, apocalyptic, meant to grip the heart with trembling. But then, light pierces the darkness. When the nations encircle Jerusalem, when Amalek's curse finds its ultimate expression in the armies of the world converging on Israel's borders, the heavens split open. The prophets declare that the Messiah will set his feet upon the Mount of Olives. The mountain will split in two, and living waters will flow out of Jerusalem. The King of Kings will ride forth, clothed in white, his robe dipped in blood, his name called Faithful and True. This is the moment when history bends. The eternal enemy, Amalek in all its forms, will make its final stand. Every tyrant, every empire, every spirit of hatred and rebellion will hurl itself against Israel, hoping to erase her from the earth once and for all. Yet in that day, the curse will meet its end, not by Israel's sword, but by the word of the returning king. Armageddon is not chaos without meaning. It is judgment with purpose. The nations that raise their fists against God's covenant will drink the cup of his wrath. The beast and the false prophet will be cast into the lake of fire. The armies arrayed against Jerusalem will melt away under the breath of the Almighty. Amalek's shadow, carried through millennia, will finally be blotted out. Not by the fragile obedience of kings, not by human effort, but by the decisive act of the Lord Himself. And then, peace. The prophets foresaw it. Swords beaten into plowshares, nations streaming to Jerusalem to learn the ways of the Lord. The desert blossoming, the lion lying down with the lamb. Children playing by the cobra's den with no fear. The covenant will no longer be a promise only. It will be sight. The king will reign from Zion, and the curse of Amalek will be remembered no more. But until that day, the tension remains. The prophecies pull us forward, urging us to watch, to discern, to understand that history's tremors are not random. Every alliance in the Middle East, every threat against Israel, every whisper of war, these are not disconnected headlines. They are pieces of a puzzle, pointing toward the day when prophecy and fulfillment collide. Amalek struck Israel in the wilderness. Amalek rose through Haman in Persia. Amalek's spirit seethed in Hitler's Holocaust, and Amalek whispers still at Israel's borders. Yet the promise of God thunders louder. The king is coming. The curse will end. The final chapter is not despair, but deliverance. The enemies may gather, but they gather for their own defeat. For when the feet of the Messiah touch the Mount of Olives, when the heavens are rent and the trumpet sounds, Amalek's long war will end in a single word: finished. From the desert sands of Rephidim to the smoking ruins of Babylon, from the gallows built by Haman to the gas chambers of Auschwitz, from rockets streaking across Israel's skies today to the prophecies of Armageddon yet to come, one thread weaves through the story: the curse of Amalek. It is not the tale of a single tribe long vanished, but the spirit of enmity that rises again and again against God's covenant people. The Bible does not soften the truth. This hatred will not cease until the Lord Himself ends it. Israel's wars, her survival, her very existence, are not accidents of history. They are living testimony that prophecy is unfolding before our very eyes. The nations rage, but Israel endures. The curse strikes, but the covenant stands. And what of us, the watchers of history? We read these ancient words and see them mirrored in modern headlines. We see nations aligning in ways the prophets described long ago. We see hatred swelling in streets and universities, in the corridors of power, and in the cries of mobs. We are not spectators of random chaos. We are witnesses of prophecy moving toward fulfillment. The lessons resound like thunder. Amalek teaches us that hatred is not always rational, nor is it easily explained by politics or power. It is spiritual, it is ancient, and it is relentless. Yet it also teaches us that God's purposes cannot be thwarted. Every rise of Amalek ends with their downfall. Every attempt to erase Israel becomes proof of her survival. Every empire that raises its hand against the covenant people falls into the dust, while Israel still stands. The story, however, does not end in the past or even in the present. It surges toward a future when the king will return, when the enemies of God will be swept away, when Jerusalem will no longer be surrounded by terror, but by nations streaming to her light. Amalek's curse will be no more, because the Lamb who was slain will reign as the Lion of Judah. And so, as we close this journey from ancient desert battles to the prophetic horizon, the call is clear. These revelations are not for curiosity alone. They are warnings, encouragements, and signposts. They urge us to discern the times, to see beyond headlines and to recognize that history is not drifting. It is marching toward the fulfillment of God's Word. If these truths have stirred your spirit, do not let them end here. Share them, speak them. Let others see that the Bible is not a dead book, but a living chronicle unfolding in our very generation. Subscribe, like, share, and comment to help spread these revelations, that more may awaken to the reality that we are living inside prophecy. But remember, this is not the end of the story. Amalek's shadow is only one piece of the prophetic puzzle. Beyond Amalek waits Gog and Magog, the gathering storm of nations from the north. Beyond them rises Babylon the Great, the mystery empire of the last days, and beyond all, the great and terrible day of the Lord. This episode has lifted the veil on Amalek. In the next, we will step deeper into prophecy's labyrinth, into the alliances of Gog and Magog, and the battle that may already be stirring on the world stage. The war is ancient, the battle is spiritual, the curse is relentless, but the victory is certain, and the story is far from finished.